All right, everybody. So we have a lesson today. We're going to get through the first half of these slides called Founding a New Nation. I'm going to give you about 30 seconds to find these on Google Classroom and get them opened up, and I would like for you to follow along. There is an exit ticket related to slides 1 through 18 that we will be covering today. All right, so when we finished up on Tuesday, we had been discussing the end of the Revolutionary War. Today we're going to be picking up right at the conclusion of that conflict. So, the American colonists on the east coast of the United States declared their independence, they fought a war, and afterwards they had to create a new system of government because they had to control this region in one way, shape, or form. And so the first idea that they had that would come about in 1777 was a national constitution, a democratic form of government, which they nicknamed the Articles of Confederation. This was the document that officially created the United States. However, it was very different than the United States government we have today. And that is because the national government was very weak. The government that oversaw all of the states, at this time there were 13, was very weak, and instead, individual state governments held majority power. There was also no president. There was no national court system, including the fact that there was no Supreme Court. And really, the only power that this national government known as Congress had was the ability to declare war on foreign enemies and the ability to regulate foreign trade. However, they could not tax states or individuals in states, and they could not enforce the laws. They required these states to do that for them. And when it came to money to pay off debts as well as troops, if there was any incidents, they would actually have to ask each state individually to voluntarily support their motives. So this was obviously not a very stable form of government. The states pretty much got to do whatever they wanted. They a lot of times would tax one another, and then large rivalries would begin to build upon neighboring states. On top of that, because of the Revolutionary War, the national government that was created was actually deeply in debt. However, they could not tax or rely on states to provide them with the money to pay back that debt because of the precedents set in the Articles of Confederation. On top of that, when it came to how the voting structure came within the national government, every state, regardless of territorial size or population size, was given one vote, making it nearly impossible for major decisions to be approved. So, when we talk about the weaknesses here, there are many. We're not going to go really into detail, but I would ask that you start to think about that because the issues that would come about in the 1780s as a result of these weak articles were pretty prevalent in the minds of many Americans. And I want you to be thinking about those as we will be talking about what will follow the articles in just a few moments. So, some of the weaknesses really started to show when foreign nations like Spain, who controlled a large portion west of our territory at the time, cut off ports in New Orleans, making it very difficult for us to settle out west. On top of that, the British never really left the region around the Great Lakes, including what we would call the Ohio River Valley, which they had actually given to this new nation after the Revolutionary War. On top of that, and really the straw that broke the camel's back, was a farmer rebellion that was led by a man named Daniel Shea, a man that was supported by many other farmers that were very upset about losing their farms due to state taxes and the debts that were pretty much being encroached upon certain states. And as a result, you would think that they would, try to figure this out swiftly. However, what ended up actually happening is the national government had to ask individual states to come in and actually break down this rebellion in order to defend national interests. and they were unable to do so. Massachusetts would end up actually sending their National Guard to take care of it. Again, just going to show how weak this first form of government, this first constitution really was. So I would like for you to take a few moments and with a partner or a neighbor discuss this question. In your eyes, what were some of the main weaknesses that were present as a result of our first constitution, the Articles of Confederation? All right, so hopefully that was enough time to think about that or discuss it. There were many weaknesses, and it was very prevalent in many of the American people, including many of the founding fathers that had supported the Revolutionary War in the early 1770s. So, by 1787, most Americans saw the Articles of Confederation as a failure. So, the states would end up actually, not all of them, but some of them, end up sending delegates, which are representatives, to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, to start talking about revising the Articles of Confederation. When they discovered that this was more or less impossible, instead they decided to replace it. This is called the First Constitutional Convention, and a second would follow. They would meet just shortly afterwards to start discussing a new constitution. But there was a problem. That problem came about with the population of states. Large states believed that we needed to have representation within the national government based upon a state's population. In other words, states with larger populations should have more votes, whereas small states, specifically in this case New Jersey, felt that the system that we already had was working and that we needed to find a way to make it work better without fully replacing the Articles of Confederation. The large states I'm talking about were primarily supported by a man named James Madison. And the plan that he proposed is known today as the Virginia Plan for the state that he was representing at the Constitutional Convention. He proposed a new national government that was stronger. It had two different representative kind of places they met within the capital. And one would specifically have representation for states based on their population. He also felt that we needed to have a representative that would specifically have power over the military and foreign policy. And he called this the president, or the executive branch. Now, the smaller states are primarily supported by a New Jersey native known as William Paterson. And the plan that he proposed was the New Jersey Plan. Again, this favored smaller states, making sure that each state, regardless of population, had equal representation. He did propose, though, that Congress should be able to tax states, but he still wanted states to maintain superior power. Now, in the end, what was decided upon was a compromise. If you've never heard of this word, it is a key tenet of democracy. A compromise is when you take both sides, the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan, and you try to make both of them happy, but also ask them to give up something. In this case, what the Great Compromise, as it became known, would decide would be that we would have two houses, two separate entities within our national government. One would be called the Senate. And in the Senate, every state had the same amount of representation, 2 elected officials. And the second house was called the House of Representatives. This was more supported by the Virginia Plan, and the amount of representation that would be according to their state would come from the population size. So larger states within the House of Representatives would have more votes than smaller states. But in the Senate, all states had an equal power, an equal vote. Once the Great Compromise had brought about an agreement amongst the large and small states, there were still certain states, specifically in the South, that had large enslaved peoples that they wanted to see count towards their total representation in the House of Representatives. These rather large states were Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina. Each of these four had over 100,000 people living within their territory that were considered enslaved. Virginia specifically had nearly 300,000. These four states wanted there to be a larger compromise to bring them into the fold, to help them agree to a new constitution. Again, they wanted to see these people, who did not have the right to vote at the time, unfortunately, be counted towards their total state population for representation. The compromise that was brought about would be known today as the Three-Fifths Compromise. What this did is it entitled these states with enslaved populations to have each of their enslaved peoples living within their population to be counted as 3/5 of a person when it came to counting the representation of a population. Now, I am very well aware that that is a deeply unfair thing to do to a human being. I'm not justifying it in any way, but this was something that was important when it came to getting everybody to agree to a new constitution. Specifically, at the time, Virginia had the largest population out of any state, and that was due to their slave population. The only state that had a larger population than them was Massachusetts. However, slavery had been abolished in Massachusetts after the Revolutionary War. Virginia wanted to be seen as the most powerful state. So in order to continue to do so and have a larger representation within the House of Representatives, they pushed for this. And don't get me wrong, they did it for their own gain at the expense of, unfortunately, mostly African Americans. All right, so once again, with the Great Compromise, it addressed the idea that large and small states wanted some type of representation based either on what was present already with the Articles as well as what this new government would propose, as well as states with large enslaved populations so that they felt that their population was accordant and counted towards their total representation in government. So, this type of government will later become known as the actual American Constitution, the one that we still use today. But before it could be voted into law, 9 of the 13 states would have to ratify it or actually approve it, sign off on getting rid of the Articles of Confederation and bringing about a new government. The problem is that within the Constitutional Convention, there were two factions, two political parties that had formed. One of these is called the Federalists. These were the ones that supported a new central government, a new constitution. They wrote several papers known as the Federalist Papers that were distributed among the public, trying to convince the people that this was the right system. What stood against them, though, is a group that we call today the Anti-Federalists. These were leaders like George Mason, like Patrick Henry, like Samuel Adams, prominent figures in the American Revolution that feared that if we gave more power to our central government, that we would more or less be creating a new monarchy, a new king within the United States. They believed the president was too much like a king, and they felt that this new Congress would not be representative of all people, whether they come from a small or a large state. They felt that the only way that they would agree to a new constitution was if we added a piece to it that would entitle American citizens with certain rights, certain liberties. And that is exactly how the Constitution was officially ratified. The Anti Federalists convinced the Federalist faction that they should add 5 additions to the final draft of the Constitution. These additions we call today amendments, and the first 10 that I'm referring to are called the Bill of Rights. These were established to make sure that the federal government, no matter how powerful it would become, could not infringe on liberties, rights of every individual citizen within the country. This gained enough support amongst people who were doubters of this new Constitution, and in 1789, the Constitution as well as the Bill of Rights would be ratified. Here are your 10 amendments included in the Bill of Rights. I'm sure you've heard of many of them before already. Probably the biggest one today that people talk about, of course, is the First Amendment. But each and every one of these definitely is important. And the interesting thing about these is that they can never change. They are set in stone. They cannot be revised. They cannot be taken away. These are promised to American citizens as long as the U.S. Constitution is still in effect. So our last slide, and where we're going to finish things today. Take about 45 seconds and discuss this question. Why was the Bill of Rights added to the Constitution? Ready, set, and go. So the Bill of Rights, of course, it was added to the Constitution primarily to get everybody on board, to have it ratified, but also to make sure that the individual rights and liberties of citizens would be protected no matter what happened.